that's when I started getting a lot of like racial derogatory comments about being Asian. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am HeyRayLee here on YouTube. If you guys are new to my channel, hello. But today I'm so excited to record this video because I'm going to be talking to you guys about my experience growing up as an Asian American in America. I stumbled across this video that Amy had posted about growing up as a Korean American. She is Vagabond Youth on YouTube. I will link her video down below. I think this topic is very common as far as like the struggles, you know, growing up, especially if you have parents who don't speak English, who were immigrants, and I could create like a whole nother video about like growing up with immigrant parents. But yeah, so I just wanted to take the time to share my story with you guys, and Amy had created a bunch of questions, so without further ado, let's get started. I am 100% Korean. I actually was born in Korea. I was born in Gangnam, and I moved here when I was 5 years old. My sister was 8, and both my parents came out here as well. So we actually moved out here for my dad's work, and I believe we were supposed to go back after 3 years and, you know, live back in Korea, but we actually ended up staying out here, and I actually didn't know how to say anything in English. I wasn't born here, and neither was my sister, so technically, like, we're not the first generation. My kids would be first generation, but since I moved here when I was so young, I consider myself being a first generation. So when my parents decided to move to America, we actually moved to the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California. And if you guys aren't familiar with that area, there are a ton of Asians. Granted, I think when I had moved there weren't that many Asian people. I remember going into first grade and there was one other Asian girl in my class, and I believe she was Korean. And so my teacher paired us up together so that she can like help me through the school, and she was so mean. Like, I remember she would like make fun of me because I didn't know how to do like the monkey bars, because like that's not a thing in Korea. I mean, I don't think it was, I don't know. And anyways, I don't think I had a lot of like bullying because I was Asian, even though I was completely a minority at the time. I think progressively as the years went by, there were more and more Asians that would attend my school. But I do remember in elementary school, like my grandmother, because she also moved out here to raise us for a little bit. So my grandmother made me Korean sushi, which is called kimbap, and it's freaking bomb. But I remember like I opened my lunch pail and at school, and everyone was like, oh my gosh, like what are you eating? Like that looks disgusting, like all this stuff. And so similar to the show Fresh Off the Boat, if you guys have watched that before, like there's an instance in there where like the character's eating, I think like black bean noodles or something, and then like everyone's like, ew, like he's eating worms or like whatever. And I remember going back home and just being super sad and essentially just like telling my family that like I only wanted like Lunchables because that was like the cool thing. I just remember like food was also just the big thing that like made me feel really like embarrassed about being like Korean, because I also remember, you know, those food drives that schools do so that you could like donate the food during like the holidays and stuff. And I remember my dad gave me this box of choco pie, and choco pie was my favorite dessert, and like I still love it to this day. But it's basically a chocolate cake with like marshmallow in the middle, and it's just delicious. And I remember my dad had given that to me so that I could drop that off during my food drive, and I was so embarrassed that like I wasn't coming to school with like a can of peas and a can of corn, and here I am like walking around with like a box of choco pie. And I remember like running to the place, the drop-off place, and like just dropping in, like running back, because I didn't want people to see that like I had dropped off this like weird dessert. But I will say like the biggest time that I had like this huge epiphany of like, oh my gosh, I'm a minority, was when I went to college. I went to college in Illinois. That was like the biggest culture shock for me, because that's when I finally realized that I was Asian, like an Asian American. That's when I started getting a lot of like racial derogatory comments about being Asian, and it was like, it wasn't even like hurtful, like it would just make me so mad that like there are people out there who are so ignorant. And I remember like a friend of mine actually came and visited from California, and we were just like walking across the street, and this was pretty late at night. It was like when I think like when the bars were closing or something like that, and I remember people yelling like, go back to your country, like you don't belong here, and like saying like ching chang whatever, like all this stuff. And I was just like, I cannot believe I go to a school where, like, you know, if I saw these students at school, they probably wouldn't say anything, but the fact that they could hide behind, and they were actually in a car, so, you know, they could hide behind just like saying that while they drive past, you know, that's when I realized like, oh my gosh, like I'm not white, and I mean clearly, but like I'm different. By the time that I went to high school, my high school had 1,000 students in just my graduating class. So there was 4,000 students at my school, and I want to say like at least 70% were Asians. So I always felt like I belonged, and like belonged as like an Asian. I don't know necessarily if I ever thought like, oh my gosh, like Korean pride, because I don't know, I just never felt like any of us were like, oh my gosh, like Chinese pride, Korean pride, like Mexican pride, or anything like that. We just kind of like all got along really well. I don't know, sometimes like I feel like I would be embarrassed to talk in Korean in like a public setting, but as I've gotten older, like I just don't care, and I'm proud to be Korean. So, you know, I'll talk to my parents in Korean, and anytime that I can, I try to, because I don't want to lose the fact that I am Korean. One was that obviously Asians are smart, and I'm the second child. My older sister is the brains of the family, and I'm like completely okay saying that. My sister went to an Ivy League school. She was and is super smart. She's a doctor. Like, I definitely did not take that route, and I felt like that was a little bit hard for me, because I remember in high school, because there were so many Asians at my school, I felt like everyone was so smart. And I remember everyone taking like AP courses, and people were applying to like UCLA as like a backup school, which like I didn't even get into UCLA. So to me, I was just like, oh my gosh, like these people are so freaking smart. And I always felt like, even though, you know, I did take AP classes and stuff, I wasn't like in the top tier of like super brainiacs. And I don't know, like I always wanted to, like I always grew up like wanting to take dance lessons. So I started like cheerleading when I was like in the 3rd grade. I like attended drill team. I was in the drill team all throughout middle school, and took dance classes like throughout high school. And I just felt like I wasn't like the stereotypical Asian. I felt like I was forced to take on these stereotypes. Like, for instance, I played piano growing up, I played cello growing up. I think as I've grown older, I realized that like, yes, some of those stereotypes are true, but I don't have to be 100% of those like stereotypes, and it's okay to not feel like you have to be like completely like extremely smart. And you know, like people are like, oh, you're like super loud and you're like very vocal, it's like not very Asian of you. And it's like, well, what does that even mean, you know? So I think, you know, like I struggled with it in the beginning, like as a child, but as I've gotten older, I just don't care. And honestly, like some of those stereotypes like I fit into. I'm Asian and I love to save money. I don't like to spend money on things that I don't have to. And you know, if that's me being Asian, then so be it. I can speak Korean, but because I moved here when I was 5, I have like the capacity of like a 5-year-old, which was really sad. So I can talk to my parents about just like basic things, but I can't talk to them about like politics or things going around like in the news and stuff. So that's a little bit frustrating. My hopes is that when I have a kid that they learn to speak Korean too. Like I want my parents to speak Korean to them. I think it's just really, really important to keep my Korean culture alive. And so yeah, growing up with parents who did not speak English very fluently was such a struggle for me, especially in like my teens. I felt like I could not communicate with my parents at all. I wasn't like the best in my teens. I think I was just like a brat, and I feel so bad for my parents, especially my dad, because I clashed with him so much. Like he and I were so different, and I think we didn't have a lot of like common grounds. And I think as a teen, it's really hard for you to like communicate in general and have this like open dialect with your parents, because you think like your parents are like the biggest enemies. So that was just like really difficult for me. I remember like we used to yell at each other, and I felt like it was just like never gonna go away. But honestly, I think you know, growing up, I've learned to be A, less of a brat, right? And B, just understand like where my parents are coming from, because at the end of the day, the reason why we were like having these like scream matches is because I clearly wasn't doing what they wanted would be like the best for me. As I've gotten older, I've gotten even more and more closer to my dad, and like honestly, I'm like a daddy's little girl, and I think it was a lot of obviously like me learning that, you know, my parents aren't there as like somebody who's trying to make my life worse. Like if anything, like they're trying to make my life way better than they, you know, the experiences that they had growing up. I am so proud to be Korean, and not even Korean, but just like Asian American. I lived in Illinois, I went to school there, and then I actually lived in Minnesota for a little bit, and I also lived in DC for a little bit. And I think being in the Midwest, I was able to kind of like educate other people about being Asian American. Since I couldn't like obviously like teach my friends, you know, Korean, I would try to like introduce them to food, because I think that's just like, eating is such a great way to experience another culture. There's so much tradition and so much culture behind food. So I would try to introduce a lot of my friends who obviously weren't familiar with like Asians with food. I feel like anytime I have like the chance to kind of just open doors for other people to like enjoy and like experience a different side of like America, then I do it through food. One of my favorite things about being an Asian American and Korean American is the fact that we're very, very family oriented. I think that my parents were a little bit different in the fact that a lot of Korean parents don't say I love you to their kids, or I don't even think like Asian parents really say I love you to their kids. It's not very common, but my parents literally would tell me that every single day. Like to this day, when I talk to my parents or my sister on the phone, we always say I love you. When I go to bed, I always say good night and I love you to my dad. That's not as common, but I think the family oriented part is very, very common, because I grew up with my grandmother and I had the chance to grow up with my grandmother. In the Korean culture, grandmothers take a really big pride in raising their grandkids. So my grandmother and I, like, she was my best friend, and I'm so happy that that was like part of my childhood. And another thing that I love about being Korean American is the fact that we really appreciate our elders. From a very young age, you're taught to be very respectful of your elders, which I think could be like a pro and a con, because there's a lot of like authority and stuff like that. But just like, you know, if you think of like the good parts of it, in Korean, there's actually different ways that you say words if someone is like of your peer or someone who is higher than you. So, and by higher than you, I mean like older than you. When you say the word like hi, for a friend, you say 안녕. But when you say it to an older person, you say 안녕하세요. So there's like two different ways of saying it. And I think that's pretty similar in Spanish too, which is like usted, I think. I don't know, I could totally be making that up. I took Spanish for like 8 years in my life, and I don't think I remember like anything. Lastly, I know I talk about food a lot, but I think it's because that was a big part of my childhood, from like traumatizing to, you know, educating other people with food. But like honestly, I love Korean food. I know this was a super long video, but I feel like I got super caught up talking about my childhood. I love hearing about how people grow up, because I think it says a lot about like who you are right now. But anyways, I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I love you guys so much, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!